Hello and welcome. I represent Midwest Toxicology, who your employer has selected to manage the drug and alcohol testing program that's mandated by DOT regulations. Our company will be doing the urine collections for your drug tests and the breath alcohol testing. In some situations, we will be coming on site to your employer's place of business to do these collections. The purpose of you viewing this video is to meet the DOT employee education requirements of 49 CFR Part 382.601. It will also cover the testing rules and a detailed explanation of how both the drug and alcohol tests are completed. You should have been given a handout to use in conjunction with viewing this video. Due to time constraints, we will not be covering all parts of the handout, although it is very important that you do read the entire handout at some point. Your employer will be asking you to sign an acknowledgement of having received this information. They need this acknowledgement on file in case they are ever audited by the DOT. The next part of this video will show the slides that coordinate with the handout. Please turn to Section A of your handout.
The purpose of this video is to give you information on the DOT drug and alcohol testing program under Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. The person designated to answer questions about your company's drug and alcohol testing program is known as the Designated Employer Representative, or the DER. In your handout in letter A, you should fill in who your DER is if it's not already filled in for you. This testing program applies to any person that has a CDL license. A CDL license is required for any person to drive a vehicle that's 26,000 pounds or more, is designed to transport 16 or more passengers, or is designed to transport hazardous material. A driver must be in compliance with these regulations anytime they're performing safety-sensitive functions. An employee is performing a safety-sensitive function during any period in which he or she is actually performing, ready to perform, or immediately available to perform any of the on-duty functions listed in letter C in your handout. We are next going to talk about what conduct is prohibited under DOT regulations. This information is discussed in letter D of your handout. Let's first talk about alcohol. There are 5 main prohibitions with regard to alcohol. First, you are prohibited from using alcohol while performing safety-sensitive functions. Second, you are prohibited from using alcohol 4 hours prior to reporting to work. This is very important to remember if you could be called into work for an emergency. For example, you just sat down to eat dinner and your supervisor calls you to see if you can come in to drive because another employee has went home sick. If you had consumed any alcohol while eating your dinner, you need to advise your supervisor of this fact. According to the DOT rules, you cannot go on duty since you have consumed alcohol within the 4-hour time frame. If you have any concerns about this prohibition and possible on-call emergency situations, please talk with your DER for further guidance. Third, you are not allowed to report for work or remain on duty with an alcohol concentration of 0.04 or greater. 0.04 is what DOT considers a positive alcohol result. Fourth, you are not allowed to use alcohol for 8 hours after an accident or until a test has been completed and you're off duty. And finally, you are not allowed to refuse to take an alcohol test when it is required. Let's next talk about drug prohibitions. DOT is concerned with illegal drug use, therefore the prohibitions are less complicated than alcohol, which is a legal substance. First, drivers are prohibited from using any drug that could affect their performance of safety-sensitive functions, including use of controlled substances unless it's been prescribed by a physician. Second, a driver is prohibited from reporting to duty or remaining on duty if they have a confirmed positive test result. And finally, an employee cannot refuse to take a drug test when it is required. The next section we're going to talk about the different required testing. Letter E in your handout discusses the different types of required tests. DOT requires tests under the following conditions: pre-employment, post-accident, random, reasonable suspicion, return to duty, and follow-up. pre-employment testing. Federal Motor Carrier requires an employer to have a negative drug test on file before they allow a driver to perform safety-sensitive functions. The employer is also required to do a background check. They must get your written consent to do this. The employer is required to go back 2 years and check with any of your previous employers that you've used your CDL license with and verify that you have not tested positive or refused a drug or alcohol test while employed with them. Post-accident testing. A driver is going to be tested for drugs and alcohol in an accident involving a commercial motor vehicle when there is either a fatality involved, the driver gets a citation plus a vehicle is towed away from the scene, or the driver gets a citation plus there's medical treatment away from the scene. It has to be one of these 3 criteria. If the accident doesn't fall under one of these criteria, then it's not a DOT required test. Now, there's also time requirements to get the testing completed with. With drug tests, they have 32 hours to get the testing done. With alcohol, you have a total of 8 hours. The employer needs to try to get the alcohol test done within the first 2 hours after the accident. If they can't, they need to document why, and then they keep trying for an additional 6 hours. If 8 hours passes and the driver is not tested, then the employer is going to stop trying to get the test done because it's really not going to mean a whole lot since alcohol does leave the body very quickly. Random testing. The majority of DOT testing falls under this category. Random selections must be made by a scientifically valid method. Midwest Toxicology uses a computer program to randomly select numbers. The numbers are then matched up to a list of employees. The employees are in a pool by their ID number, usually their social security number or their driver's license number. The computer program automatically matches up the number with the individual's name, and that list is given to the employer as the names that need to be tested for that random draw. The testing rates can vary from 10 to 50% and will change each year. Currently, Federal Motor Carrier requires 50% of the pool to be tested for drugs each year and 10% for alcohol each year. These are minimum requirements, and employers can choose to do greater percentages if they choose. The selections are done randomly also in the sense that every time a draw is done, everybody has the same equal chance of being selected, which means that some drivers will be tested more than once during the year, and others could go for a couple years without being drawn. The selections are also spread throughout the year so that drivers cannot predict when the next random test is going to occur. Once a driver has been notified of a random test, they must report immediately to take that test. Questions about random. What if I drive for more than one employer? The answer: you must be in each of your employer's testing pools. Can I be excused from a random test? No, you cannot. The only reasons you would possibly be excused from taking a test is if you are no longer employed by the employer, or if you are on an extended leave and not expected back to work before the time the next random draw would occur. What if I'm not working the day that Midwest Toxicology comes on site for a random test? You will be tested on a different day. Arrangements will be made for either us to come back on site to test you, or you will be sent to a local medical clinic on a day when you are working. When can your employer randomly test you? A drug test can be done at any time you are at work. Employers are also allowed to call you in for a drug test if you are not at work, if that is their policy. An alcohol test, though, can only be done if you are working that day. Reasonable suspicion. Your employer can test you if there's reasonable suspicion that you have violated prohibited conduct. A trained supervisor must make this determination, and their decision to test must be based upon your appearance, behavior, speech, or body odor. The employer is also required to have written documentation behind the reasoning as to why that supervisor decided to test you for reasonable suspicion. Return to duty and follow-up tests. These tests are required after a driver has tested positive or refused a test. The driver must first complete DOT-required rehabilitation before they're eligible for the return to duty test. They must test negative on the return to duty test before they will be allowed to resume safety-sensitive functions. After that, they will be subject to a minimum of 6 follow-up tests in the first 12 months they're back to work. Follow-up tests can continue for up to 5 years based on the opinion of the employer or the substance abuse professional. Let's next talk about alcohol testing procedures. Only approved breathalyzer instruments will be used to conduct alcohol tests under DOT procedures. The technician that does the test is called a BAT, or a breath alcohol technician. Everybody goes through an initial test, followed by a confirmation test if the initial test is .02 or higher. If a screening and confirmation test is required, the confirmation test will be the final test result. Below a .02 is considered a negative alcohol test. If a driver tests between a .02 up to and including a .039, they will be required to be removed from duty for a period of 24 hours. .04 and above is considered a positive test, where the driver will be required to be removed from duty immediately and will then be referred to a substance abuse professional, or a SAP. The following demonstration will show how a typical breath alcohol test is conducted. DOT allows saliva alcohol testing as well as breath alcohol testing. Midwest Toxicology usually uses breath alcohol testing technology. The individuals that will conduct these tests are known as BATs, or breath alcohol technicians. Midwest Toxicology currently has 2 different types of instruments to perform breath alcohol testing. The first one shown here is the SD5, which is able to do screening tests only. The second type of instrument we have is the Intoxilyzer 200. The Intoxilyzer 200 is capable of doing screening tests and confirmation tests. It has the ability to print out the results in triplicate. Each employee selected for a breath alcohol test will be required to show a photo ID. Acceptable forms of photo ID include any government-issued photo ID or any employer-issued photo ID. If no photo ID is readily available, then a supervisor may ID the employee for the breath alcohol technician. After the photo ID is shown to the breath alcohol technician, the employee will be asked to sign a consent in step 2. The consent states that I certify I am about to submit to alcohol testing required by U.S. Department of Transportation regulations, and that the identifying information provided on the form is true and correct. Any employee required to take a DOT breath alcohol test must first go through an initial screening test. The video shows a BAT performing a screening test using the SD5. Any result below a .02 is considered negative and no further testing is needed. This video shows a BAT performing a confirmation test using the Intoxilyzer 200. Once the instrument is done analyzing the breath sample, the results will be displayed on the LCD screen of the instrument. Then the BAT will have the results printed out on the instrument. These results will then be attached to the alcohol testing form. Once the test results have been handwritten in on the alcohol testing form or printed out and attached to the alcohol testing form, the BAT will complete step 3. Step 4 is only completed if the employee has a positive reading of .04 or greater. Once the form is complete, then the BAT will distribute the copies. There are 3 copies, one for the employee, one for the company, and one for the BAT. Questions about alcohol testing. What if I can't blow hard enough or long enough to complete the breath test? In this situation, it could be deemed a refusal to test if the driver does not have a valid medical explanation. At this point in the process, the BAT would discuss with the DER that you have not completed the breath test and should be directed for a medical evaluation. Second question, will such things as mouthwash, breath sprays, or medicines with alcohol in them cause me to have a positive reading? No, not on the confirmation test result. In DOT testing procedures, if somebody had just consumed a product such as these, yes, it is possible to get a reading on that screening test, but the procedures require us to wait 15 to 30 minutes and repeat the test over in the confirmation test. During that 15 to 30 minutes, alcohol found in products such as these would have either dissipated or been absorbed and are negligible, meaning they will not show up on the final confirmation test result. Let's next talk about drug testing procedures. You will be tested for 5 drugs: amphetamines, which includes methamphetamines, cocaine, marijuana, opiates, which includes codeine, morphine, and heroin, and PCP or phencyclidine. Urine collection procedures are summarized under letter G in your handout. The following demonstration will explain how the complete collection process is done. All DOT tests are done using a federal custody and control form. The custody and control form contains the name, address, phone number, and fax number of the employer as well as the medical review officer. The collector is responsible for initiating the chain of custody and completing it correctly. Each employee tested will be required to provide a photo ID. Acceptable forms of photo ID include any government-issued ID, any employer-issued ID. If no photo ID is readily available, then the employee's supervisor can ID the employee for the collector. The collector will then ask the employee to empty their pockets and display the contents to the collector. Any items that could be used to adulterate a specimen will not be allowed inside the restroom. Some examples include butane lighters, tobacco products, lipstick or chapsticks, or eye drops. Next, the collector will ask the donor to rinse their hands off with water and then dry their hands thoroughly before they enter the restroom. The employee will select the collection kit. The collector will open it in their presence. Inside the kit contains 2 specimen bottles, a plastic specimen bag, and the collection cup. The collector will inform the employee how much urine is needed to complete the collection before going into the restroom. When the employee exits the restroom, they should hand the collector their collection cup. The collector will then do a visual inspection of the urine to ensure that it's a normal, valid urine specimen. They'll first check to make sure that the temperature of the specimen is within range. They will next check to make sure that there's at least 45 milliliters of urine. And then finally, they'll check to make sure there's not an unusual odor or appearance with the urine. If everything looks acceptable, they will then pour the specimen into the 2 collection bottles. Then they will take the seals from the chain of custody and seal up each of the bottles. Please note that on each of the seals there's a specimen ID number which matches the specimen ID number on the custody and control form. The collector will then ask the employee to date and initial each of the seals that have been placed over their specimen bottles. After the labels have been initialed, the collector will turn to copy 2 of the custody and control form and complete step 5. In step 5, the employee will be asked to sign a statement that reads, "I certify that I provided my urine specimen to the collector, that I have not adulterated it in any manner. Each specimen bottle used was sealed with a tamper-evident seal in my presence, and that the information provided on this form and on the label affixed to each specimen bottle is correct." In addition, the collector at some point during the process will ask the employee for a daytime and/or evening phone number where the medical review officer could contact the employee should there be any questions regarding their drug test results. In step 5, the collector will also print the employee's name, date, and note the date of birth of the employee. The collector will then flip back to the top copy of the custody and control form and complete the form. Once the form has been completed, the collector will tear off the top copy, fold that up, and place it inside the plastic specimen bag along with the 2 specimen bottles. The specimen is now ready to be shipped to the lab. Finally, the collector will turn to copy 5 of the custody and control form, which is the donor copy, Tear that off and hand it to the employee and instruct the employee that the collection is complete and they are free to go. Questions regarding the urine drug collection procedures. Should I tell the collector what medications I'm taking? No. DOT rules specifically require the collector to inform the donor that they cannot take any medical information. If any medical information is required, the medical review officer will contact you at the phone number that the collector asked you for. A few more questions regarding the collection procedures. What if I can't go? In this situation, we deem it a shy bladder. The donor will be informed that they have up to 3 hours to provide a specimen, can drink up to 40 ounces of fluid, but during this time frame they must be under the observation of their supervisor or the collector. If 3 hours passes and they still have not provided a specimen, it could be deemed a refusal to test if there is not a valid medical explanation. Second question, will my collection always be done in private? Yes, unless the urine temperature you give on the first specimen is below or above the acceptable range, or the donor has attempted to alter or substitute their specimen, or if you've provided a previous invalid specimen and the MRO has requested a recollect under observed conditions, or if the driver is on return to duty or follow-up tests. These can be observed based on the opinion of the employer or the substance abuse professional. Once the urine specimen is collected, it's sent to the laboratory for testing. Letter H in your handout discusses the laboratory testing procedures. All DOT testing must be done at SAMHSA certified laboratories. All specimens go through an initial test, often an immunoassay. If it screens negative, it's issued negative and it's done testing. If it screens positive for one of the 5 drugs, then it goes on to a confirmation test. Confirmation is done by a process called gas chromatography mass spectrometry, which is often abbreviated GCMS. Besides testing for the 5 drugs, labs also do validity testing. The purpose of validity testing is to determine whether certain adulterants or foreign substances were added to the urine, if the urine was diluted, or if the specimen was substituted. The lab does this by checking the specific gravity, the creatinine, and the pH of the specimen, as well as testing for known adulterants. Based on these test results, the lab can determine if the specimen is diluted, substituted, or adulterated. Substituted and adulterated had the same consequences as a refusal to test, which had the same consequences as testing positive. With diluted test results, some company policies might require the driver to be retested. Once the lab is done testing the specimen, the test results are released to the MRO, the Medical Review Officer. The Medical Review Officer acts as the gatekeeper for accuracy and integrity in the testing program. The MRO's responsibilities include reviewing each test result, interviewing donors who have a result reported from the lab as a positive, adulterated, or substituted specimen. They are also responsible for contacting the DER on diluted test results. They're required to inform donors of the retest option if they have tested positive or have an adulterated or substituted specimen. And finally, they are the ones that report the test results to the DER. Can the laboratory make an error? If you feel the lab has made an error, the MRO will explain to you that you do have the right to have your specimen retested at a different lab. The MRO will tell you that you have 72 hours to make this request. The cost of this retest will depend on your company policy. Most company policies require the employee to pay for the cost of the retest. If the retest results would be different from the original test, then the test will be canceled. So far in the history of DOT testing, no SAMHSA certified lab has ever made a mistake on a DOT test. Letter J in your handout discusses what constitutes a refusal to test. Failing to appear or remain at the test site until the test is completed is considered a refusal to test. Failing to provide a specimen within the required time frame unless a valid medical explanation exists. A determination of adulterated or a substituted specimen from the lab is also considered a refusal to test. And finally, failing to cooperate with the testing process, such as refusing to empty the contents of your pockets or behaving in a confrontational way, are both considered a refusal to test. What happens if you test positive or refuse to take a test? DOT requires that you be immediately removed from duty as soon as possible. Second, DOT requires you to be referred to a substance abuse professional, often abbreviated as a SAP. After that, it depends on your company's policy as to what will happen to you next. DOT leaves that completely up to policy as to whether an individual is terminated or if they're given a second chance. If they're given a second chance, they must follow DOT requirements to return to safety-sensitive duties. Letter K in your handout discusses the DOT required procedures if a person's tested positive or refused to test. As stated before, you're removed from duty immediately. You're referred to a substance abuse professional. At that point, then the SAP must do an evaluation and recommend a treatment program. The employee is required to complete the SAP's recommendations and will often have a second evaluation by the SAP so that the SAP can verify that they've completed your education and treatment satisfactorily. At that point, then the SAP can recommend at what point you're ready to take your return to duty test. Again, that test must be negative before you go back to safety-sensitive duties, and in addition, you will be required to do follow-up tests, a minimum of 6 in the first 12 months you're back to work. Letter M in your handout discusses the effects of alcohol. Alcohol is the most abused drug in our nation, although many people do not view it as a drug since it is a legal substance and it is very socially accepted. It's important for drivers to understand that small amounts of alcohol can affect their performance behind the wheel of a vehicle. Alcohol works and affects the central nervous system. In general, it slows down your body's functions, which in turn causes impairment in your driving ability. Letter M discusses in great detail how alcohol affects your health, your driving ability, and some general social issues associated with it. I would encourage everyone to take some time to read through these thoroughly. At the end of section M in your handout that discusses alcohol, there is a chart. The chart is designed to give you an idea of what your blood alcohol content might be based on your body weight and the number of drinks you consumed in 1 hour. The purpose of the chart is to show you that for most of us, it does not take a large amount of alcohol or a large amount of number of drinks to get above that 0.04 level. For most of us, 2 or 3 drinks will put us above that 0.04 level. Keep in mind that this chart refers to number of drinks. 1 drink is equivalent to 12 ounces of beer, 5 ounces of wine, or 1.5 ounces of 80 proof liquor. We often get asked the question, well, how long does it take my body to detoxify or metabolize alcohol? In general, it takes about an hour to an hour and 15 minutes to detoxify 1 drink. So if you've consumed 3 beers the night before, you go to work the next morning at 7 a.m., you do not need to be concerned about that alcohol that you consumed the night before showing up on a breath alcohol test. The last part of your handout discusses the effects of the different categories of drug that you're being tested for. The first one is marijuana. Marijuana is the most commonly used illegal drug. It is also the most misunderstood and underestimated drug. Its action is almost exclusively on the brain, where it alters the ability for messages to be interpreted by your brain. The immediate effects of being under the influence of marijuana often cause reddened eyes, increased heart rate, and dry mouth and throat. Chronic or long-term effects include a reduced efficiency of the body systems, impaired memory, slowed reaction time, poor concentration, and impaired motor skills, and possibly addiction. THC, which is the active ingredient in marijuana, is stored in the body fat and slowly released over time. Marijuana potency has increased 500 to 800% in recent years, meaning that 5 to 6 joints per week today could equal approximately 15 to 40 joints per week in 1978. It's important for people to realize that even smoking just one joint can impair their driving ability 4 to 6 hours. What about secondhand smoke? That's the most common excuse the MRO will hear from a person that's tested positive for marijuana, and it is not valid. Secondhand smoke will not cause a person to test positive for marijuana on a DOT test. The cutoff levels that are used in the testing process are high enough where the person would have to ingest that marijuana themselves, whether they smoked it, injected it, or ate something that had marijuana in it. So yes, if a person eats a brownie with marijuana in it, what will happen? Yes, it's possible for you to test positive because you have ingested it. It is in your body. Your handout next discusses cocaine and amphetamines, which are both stimulant drugs and have very similar effects. The U.S. consumes 75% of the world's cocaine. Both drugs have very little medical use. Both stimulant drugs cause increased heart rate, respiration, blood pressure, body temperature, and dilated pupils. Chronic and long-term effects include irritability, anxiety, depression, loss of appetite, sleeplessness, addiction, brain damage, and above all, addiction. The next category of drugs is opiates, which includes heroin, morphine, and codeine. These drugs are medically used to relieve pain. They can be found as natural opiates or synthetic opiates. In general, opiates cause relaxation, induce sleep, reduce pain, and slow body functions. Chronic and long-term effects of these types of drugs include restlessness, nausea, vomiting, addiction, slowed breathing, and death can occur in some cases. DOT is concerned mainly with heroin. Fortunately, we see very few heroin users in the workplace. If a person's addicted to heroin, it's a very destructive addiction, and they are often not able to hold down a regular full-time job. The last category of drug to discuss is phencyclidine or PCP. There is no medical use for PCP. Although it was first developed in the 1950s as an anesthetic, it was quickly abandoned in trials due to the bad side effects that occurred. PCP acts as both a depressant and a hallucinogen, as well as a stimulant. It's most often abused for its mood-altering effects. It's a very bad drug, and it has a bad reputation in that it's very hard to predict what a person's going to act like if they're under the influence of PCP. Because of this, it's not abused very often, and we really do not see a lot of people testing positive for PCP in workplace drug testing programs. We are now done summarizing the main points of your handout, although we do encourage you to go back and read it more thoroughly, as there are many points that we are not able to discuss in detail during this video. Your employer should also have you sign some kind of statement that you have gone through the employee education materials as required by Federal Motor Carrier regulations. Thank you for your time and attention.